Nutrition labels. When I was a kid, we didn't drink water. Nobody drank water. We drank soda. Once you started having nutritional labels, people started paying attention to calories. Then food started changing what we consume. I think there should be a CO2 label on everything that's manufactured. You should understand the impact of that product.
2050 timeline, this huge macro objective. We need top-down change, right? We need industrial shift. We need a policy and real democratic shift in thinking. These institutions historically, they are influenced by the demographic that they engage with. The profit motive drives the sort of decision-making that the corporate sector makes. The democratic motive drives the decision-making that the political sector makes, public sector to a degree. There's some influence, third-party influence there.
When you think about, I was on your website, and it looks like you break kind of down your areas of focus for companies, individuals. You also have classes and projects. Maybe can you elaborate a little bit more on how you're approaching this? And strategically, kind of why have you honed in on those areas?
For sure. So we started the business very B2C focused, with a really intentful focus on the idea of changing individual decision making. And we haven't really lost that from a user experience perspective. We just shifted the context of that individual. Within early days of our company, we had major companies reaching out saying, hey, can we roll this out with our workforce? This is a wonderful idea to measure individual footprints, offset those footprints, offer passive reduction. We now focus within organizations because what we see are major institutions, like we have, client like Capital One as an example, who's got a climate strategy of their own. We have many others who are deep into their 10-year, 20-year drawdown plan, and they need to find ways to disseminate this complex set of targets and behavioral changes and objectives to this 10,000, 20,000 person workforce. But there's fundamental gaps. There's scientific language. There's underlying concepts that maybe some people assume are known, but there's basic knowledge gaps that prevent clear communication. And in order for us to hit these 2030, 2050 paths to net zero, we need to be a cohesive unit drawing in the same direction of our path of drawdown. So you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned for individuals. So it's really important that anybody can take part in Carbon Neutral Club to understand their footprint and find some paths of drawdown. But the most critical gap we've found across every demographic, every part of the world, every sector is education being the biggest and most critical gap. It's this common language. We can sit here and talk about 2050, but what does it mean? And why are we making these decisions, and what's the value? Even if it costs us in the short term, what's the ROI long term? So we're focused really intently on storytelling, making it personalized with your data, giving you a net zero plan of your own effectively within work and home, and a huge anchor that's classes and content.
Yeah, I think that is the biggest part of all this. And that's the reason I'm spending time doing this podcast, because I was seeking answers and I found it hard. And you realize that, you can't improve what you can't measure. And so some of the things I was looking at was like nutrition labels. So as a kid, we didn't have nutrition labels when I was born. So now I'm kind of dating myself. And then they became more complex. And then all of a sudden we started caring what calories were, right? When I was a kid, we didn't drink water. Nobody drank water. We drank soda full of calories, right? And then everything became, so you see this trend. Well, once you started having nutritional labels, people started paying attention to calories. Then food started changing what we consumed. And I think my hope around climate, it's the same thing. I think there should be a CO2 label on everything that's manufactured. You should understand the impact of that product. And I think manufacturers should have some level of accountability to the products they produce. And today they really don't, right? You can create whatever you want, and there's very little accountability there. So, I do think that's the hard part, with this is, the good part about all this is forcing companies to actually start to ask the question, what is their impact, right? And then it's kind of what you're talking about. How do you build it into the regular cadence of business where you have your quarterly business reviews? You're talking about your P&Ls, you're talking about finance, and then you're also talking about this, right? And I just think historically most companies haven't done it, or they haven't had the infrastructure to even measure or workflow to even figure out how to do it.
Or an incentive. That's a big companies don't have the reason to do it. Maybe they want to do it. Everyone in the boardroom says, yeah, great. But then something that's revenue generating comes up, and that's got to be a priority. Or there's some fire, and so we're seeing some great examples of the incentive coming out of like peer-to-peer sort of pressures. Companies like Walmart, as an example, you have to have some carbon accounting reporting being done. So if you want to sell to them, there's this concept of trickle-down carbonomics that we talk about a lot over here, where if you want to do business with these big companies, you have to align with their carbon accounting modules. And part of that's a regulatory requirement for them, but also it creates that reason, a real financial incentive for someone to prioritize it.
I think it's gonna come from all sides. You need government pressure and policy, and then you need like bottoms up, kind of what you're talking about. As individuals now being enlightened and educated and saying, hey, no, we want to start to do this here. What is our company doing? And holding management teams accountable to say, hey, what's the plan? I think that's also probably the hard part with some of these, because I have talked to some larger companies and they talk about these big targets they want to get after. And then you start to double click and you realize, oh, wait a minute. It's just, it's easy to put a target out there when it's a decade, 2 decades out.
Right.
But what are the milestones along the way? How do you know you're even tracking towards that?
Yes, it's very easy to build a report and ship it. And I think the stat is 7% of corporate net zero targets are on track for the objectives that they'd set for themselves. There are some who are exceptional and doing exactly as they said they would, but it's a really complex path. Even if the intent is very real, it's hard to translate that intent into action and do it across departments, geographies. It's just a complex objective. And the gap is not the intent. The intent seems to be there. The regulatory world is going to catch up and create that intent and that incentive. But the biggest gap we're seeing is our sustainability teams and leaders having a resource gap, either lacking the right toolkit to disseminate, really communicate effectively across large distributed teams, in the way that maybe growth teams or human resource teams, they have that existing infrastructure and how to do these, long-term change management activities. The sustainability apparatus is relatively fresh and being built right now as the plane flies, sort of thing.
Yeah.